Hello, welcome everybody. Shana Tova. My name is Rabbi Rebecca Serbu, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Jewish Funders Network. And we are thrilled to have you with us today for this highly informative seminar on what is the future of Zionism? What does Zionism mean today? This is obviously a very hot topic, given what is going on in current events. The webinar will be an hour and 15 minutes, so I hope that you stay with us for the entire conversation. And it is now my great pleasure to welcome and introduce my colleague, Andrés Spokoiny, the CEO of the Jewish Funders Network. Andrés. Oh,
Yes. Yeah, we've been doing this for only 5 years, this Zoom, so it's obvious that you don't know how to unmute. Welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be having this stimulating conversation that is very topical. And, the 19th century was a time in which political utopias were developed. Some people believe in a socialist paradise, others in the 1,000 Years Reich, others in communes, and others in eternal economic progress. It was a time of utopias. And Jews also had their own utopic dream back then, the establishment of a Jewish sovereign state in our ancient homeland. That utopia was called Zionism. To this day, Zionism remains the only political utopia ever realized. Zionism is probably the most significant revolution in the history of the Jewish people. David Ben-Gurion wrote in 1944, all other revolutions were uprising against a system, against a political, social, or economic structure. But our revolution is against not a system, but against fate, against the unique fate of a unique people. In other words, Zionism transformed Jews from passive objects of history to owners of their own destiny. Thanks to Zionism, history is not something that happens to us, but something that we do. Zionism gave us power, as we're seeing this day, with all the messiness and complexity that entails. Moreover, Zionism affected the most profound transformation in Jewish identity because it changed the world and it changed us. Zionism is, at least in my opinion, one of the most inspiring movements in human history. But now, 150 years after the beginnings of modern political Zionism, Zionism appears to be in a state of perplexity. First of all the 19th century ideologies, especially nationalism, are in turmoil, and Zionism is not an exception. Second, the term Zionism is losing its original meaning. For some, it has become a slur. For others, is a cudgel to beat their political opponents. On the other hand, it has become the focus of a battle for Jewish legitimacy around the world. And last, but certainly not least, extremists are claiming to own the brand of Zionism and define it anew in their image. So in this context, we ask the question, what is the future of Zionism? Does it have one? And what is our role as funders and leaders in the current climate? These questions are not merely academic now, but elicit strong passions and in many cases, violence. So obviously, in this conversation, we're not going to be answering these questions completely. We aim just to spark a conversation that each of us will need to carry on in our different settings in which we evolve. To spark our thinking, we have 3 great speakers who love Israel passionately, but look at these questions from a different angle, and of course, from different geographic locations. So we have Dr. Rachel Fish, who co-founded the nonprofit Boundless. It's a think action tank partnering with community leaders across North America to deal with Jewish education and combat Jew hatred. Dr. Fish is an academic with a long and prestigious career, advisor to Brandeis University Initiative of Anti-Semitism, associate professor at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. She teaches Israeli history and society at George Washington University, and she is part of the educational leadership of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development. She was also the executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, and she was a senior advisor to the Polly Singer Foundation in New York and executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. Yossi Klein Halevi, good friend of the house, is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, one of the brightest minds in Jewish thinking these days. He co-directs the Institute for Muslim Leadership, which teaches emerging young Muslim Americans about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Not an easy task. And Halevi's book from 2013 that many of us read, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council Everett Book of the Year award. And his latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller. Anshel Pfeffer is a journalist in Haaretz that even people that hate Haaretz read often. It's the Economist Israel correspondent. He has been writing since 2015. And his latest book, Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, is one of the most intriguing books about this complex character. So, with introductions out of the way, let's dive in. And I want to start with Anshel because, full disclosure, one of the stimulus for this conversation was an article by Anshel that I read in 2018, where Anshel says something really provocative about Zionism. Now, Anshel is, by most people's definition, a staunch Zionist, lives in Israel, serves in the army, believes in the state, but he thinks that we should stop talking about Zionism. He basically claims, and you're going to expand on this, that Zionism was a program, not an ideology. That program is done. Zeu, next. So did I catch the meaning of what you wanted to say right?
Yeah, I think you did, Andrés. And also in your introduction, when you described Zionism as a utopia which became reality, there's a reason why it's the one utopia that became reality, because it was from the very start of political Zionism. We tend to put that as at Herzl's first Zionist Congress, though we know it wasn't really the first Zionist Congress. Kovei Zion had a couple of congresses before Herzl came along, but we still call that, in history, the first Zionist Congress. It was programmatic. Herzl wrote a program. Now, Herzl wrote that program at the end of the 19th century in an era when the great empires were still around, and one not so great empire, but a weakening, a much diminished empire was in charge of what was then a province in the Ottoman Empire, which the place which would one day become Israel. And Herzl wrote a program which fitted in with his ideas of what a Western colony of one of the empires would look like when it had a majority of Westernized Jews living in the place which was the Promised Land. And that was very much a program that fit in with the ideas of his day, of sort of kind of a Western assimilated type of Jew. But what would and he called it the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, but actually what he was talking about was sort of a protectorate. He thought it perhaps would be under the Ottomans and under the Germans. He talked to the British, but it was a program of what he thought was feasible as a haven, as a semi-autonomous or fully autonomous area in which Jews would live, which was also happened to be the biblical homeland of the Jews. And that was the program that he presented to the Zionist Congress. And there were already then arguments, and Herzl died not that long after, when with the movement in crisis over the Uganda question, and in the next generation of Zionism, the post-Herzl but still pre-state, then you had the arguments between the pragmatic Zionists and the diplomatic Zionists, those who thought that the most important thing is to send pioneers to the to Palestine and start building the state, even before it officially began. And then you had those who said, no, the most important thing is to continue Herzl's work of diplomacy with the big powers so we can get an endorsement. And they saw the Balfour Declaration as a huge success, though arguably the Balfour Declaration didn't actually do anything to make the state become. And then you had the later arguments from the 1920s between what was the rising force in the Zionist movement, which was the socialist Zionists, Ben-Gurion's what would become the Mapai Party, and you had the breakaway of the revisionists who didn't like the idea of socialism as part of Zionism, and they had a more militant approach. And all these things ultimately were plans, what is the best way to make this dream of returning to our land and becoming a majority, becoming a sovereign entity on this land. What's the best way of achieving that? And Ben-Gurion and most of his biographers will agree. He thought that socialism, collective economy, building things like the trade unions, the Stadrut, and the other the industries which were basically owned and run by the Stadrut, and the health funds and so on, the social structures of that, and ultimately also a defense force, the Haganah, which would become the IDF. This was the way to. This was the fastest way to do it. And he wasn't a socialist ideologue. He had read obviously Marx and the other great writers of socialism and communism, but he didn't think that in itself was an aim. The aim was the state, and he thought, and it turned out he was right, that the fastest, most efficient way to build a state, to make it a reality, and to secure it, was through the collective socialist structure. And it worked. And Ben-Gurion was the man who stood up in May 1948 and proclaimed the state. And therefore, Zionism is not an ideology. Zionism, to my mind, and I think that is what it is in history, is much more a question of what is the best way of achieving a Jewish state, because Jews need a state as a haven, and because Jews historically lived in this part of the land, and therefore that's the aim. How do we get to that aim? Ben-Gurion came up with the most efficient way, but there were other ideas, and there's also religious Zionism. From the very beginning, the Mizrahi were there. And if you look at those who oppose Zionism, yes, there were people who said that in itself, the idea of Jewish sovereignty is a bad idea. But most of the arguments against Zionism were pragmatic arguments. There were those who said it's not going to work. And there were those who said maybe it will work, probably it won't work, but it'll cause us problems in the diaspora because we have to be focused on equal rights and protecting Jews in the diaspora. And if instead we focus on a state, then our campaign to become equal citizens and enjoy all the protections of in our home countries will be weakened, and perhaps even people will say, "Well, just go off to Palestine and leave here, and we don't want to give you any rights." So the arguments against Zionism were largely, and yes, there was the ultra-Orthodox arguments against Zionism because how can we intervene in God's plans? But the fact is that God seemed, for those who believe that God's hand was in it, God seemed to be okay with with Zionism because it happened. So all these things, I think, and I accept that you can argue that there was also an ideological side to it, but ultimately Zionism was a pragmatic concept. What is we need a state for all these very important reasons, and what's the best way of getting to do that? And May 1948, the plan became reality, as you said, and Zionism was a success. And I think that the way in which we continue speaking about Zionism as something which exists, as something that we need to somehow still fulfill, I think that it, in many ways, is causing us harm. First of all, it helps sustain very corrupt and unnecessary organizations. And if there are people here who work or have worked or have important ties with the Zionist organization and the various Jaffe and JNF and UJ and all that stuff, kol hakavod, you do, some of you do important things, but the structure of a sort of alternative Jewish government, when we already have a state, I think is a bad thing. It creates corruption. It creates all these needless sort of double organizations that really, instead of allowing it to develop as a country, which is what Zionism was supposed to achieve, I think these organizations hold Israel back. And it's not a coincidence that Israel doesn't send its best and brightest politicians and leaders to be the heads of these organizations. Let's put it mildly. And that, to me, is not just an organizational failure. It's also a problem because it means that we're not looking at Israel as a real country in which we have to be thinking, what are the priorities? We're not thinking, first of all, we're not taking criticism the right way. We take the criticism of Israel as criticism of Zionism, and the idea that someone can critique something which doesn't exist anymore. Because in my mind, Zionism is something which was done and which was successfully done. When people say you're a post-Zionist, I say, well, most post-Zionists have reservations about Zionism. I have no reservation about Zionism. Zionism was a huge success, but I use the past tense. And I think now we have to focus on making Israel a better place. And Baruch Hashem, there are so many things that we need to do to make Israel a better place. And by going into this argument, both within us about what is Zionism and is it a good thing, is it a bad thing, and how do we do Zionism, we are allowing ourselves to be deflected for all the wrong reasons from the burning priorities that we have today in making Israel. Israel is not in a good state. I think, actually, Likud MK said to me yesterday, I think we're in a great state, but I think you need to be a Likud member, or a paid Likud member, to say that nowadays. But I think there is, beyond that, a total agreement that we're not in a good state right now, and not just because everything that happened on October 7th. Since we haven't been on a good trajectory for a while, sadly, and there's a lot of things that we need to look focused. And I think it also causes harm, and I know I'm kind of taking too much time, so I'll just finish very quickly, in the way that we talk to the world, both to our friends and of course to our critics, because by making the conversation about Zionism, we are allowing others to question the whole plan. Now, what country has sort of a founding ideology that is still around 78 years after the country was founded and still is argued about? No, Zionism was a huge success. Ben-Gurion, his version of Zionism won. The state was founded against all the odds. It survived. It prospered. Enough. Now we have to talk about this state. Unless we're in our 80s, we were all been blessed to have been born into this reality, which is the state of Israel. Our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents did, achieved for us this incredible thing. Now let's work on making it a better thing rather than being dragged down by these arguments, and having these arguments with those who call themselves anti-Zionists without even knowing what Zionism is basically accepting their argument that there is something questionable about Zionism. And I don't want to accept that. I'm not going to go into an argument. I mean, I can have a historic argument. I can say, were the Zionists, did they have the right idea 80, 90, 100 years ago? Did they have the right idea? But if I'm going to argue with you about Zionism today, I'm accepting that there is a question mark over the entire existence of Israel. I do not accept that question mark. And therefore, engaging in Zionism, I think, is wrong. I think we should give the Zionism the respect that it deserves as a historic concept and talk today about how we make Israel a better place.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anshel. Lots and lots to unpack. And I want to turn to Yossi now because, I grew up and I still consider myself an ideological Zionist. So what Anshel says is a little, problematic for me. And I mean, not only me, Shlomo Avineri wrote his book about Zionism and said Zionism is a permanent revolution. The moment it ceases to be a revolution and an ideology, loses, Israel also loses its sort of its raison d'etre. So where do you stand on that? I mean, I think that there are things that Anshel said that we all agree. I mean, legitimizing the anti-Zionism discourse with a debate is pointless. But where do you stand on this idea of, does it make sense to continue talking about Zionism today, or we just say, listen, Zionism was a program, it achieved its goal, next. Now we talk about Israel and how to improve Israel, and we don't entertain anymore that? Or is Zionism an ideology that still has a role to play in Jewish life and in Israel?
So I actually agree with just about everything that Anshel said, and yet in the end, I disagree with the premise that Zionism is only a program. I think Zionism was a program and is an ideology. I'd like to try to unpack that. In the 19th century, the great identity crisis of the Jewish people was that religion, which had been the unifying force for the Jewish people throughout the diaspora, and an extraordinary achievement. A traveling Jew, a wandering Jew, could go from Poland to Yemen and more or less have a shared basic language in almost any part of the diaspora that you went through because of a shared groundedness in rabbinic Judaism. In the 19th century, religion, rabbinic Judaism, went from being the great unifying force to being the great divide within the Jewish people. We lost our commonality. And 19th century European Jewry is in part the story of the attempt to fill that void, to substitute new ideas of identity, but there was no cohesiveness. The Bund basically said the Jews are a class, the Jews are a working class, and they were only interested in Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern European Jews specifically. Reform Judaism said the Jews are only a religion. The Haredim basically were a variation of Reform Judaism, and they didn't repudiate peoplehood, but in practice, they acted like Reform Judaism in their relationship to the rest of the Jewish people. And the Zionists came along and said the commonality, that what binds the Jewish people together is the Jewish people. It's Jewish peoplehood. And so Zionism became the ideology of the lowest common denominator of peoplehood. Now, that side of Zionism, what I consider to be today the only real relevant legacy of Zionism, which is defining the Jews as a people, as our primary identity. Jew is the noun, and all of our subsidiary ideologies are the adjective. That became really subsumed in the urgency of fulfilling the Zionist program. And here I agree with Anshel that the Zionist program has thankfully reached its endpoint, has been fulfilled. And for us to continue to confuse the Zionist program for Zionist ideology is, I think, the great mistake that we're making today. And yes, Anshel, you're absolutely right. We play into the hands of those who are trying to undermine our legitimacy by continuing this ridiculous argument about our right to exist. I spoke to a group of German journalists a few years ago who were visiting Jerusalem, and one of them said to me, we are pro-Israel. We're very pro-Israel in Germany. We support your right to exist. And I said, we're very pro-German here in Israel. We support your right to exist. And they all laughed a little nervously. But the absurdity of finding ourselves still defending our right to exist is in part our fault. I don't think it's only our fault, but we certainly play into the hands of our enemies when we continue to argue the case that was really resolved 78 years ago.
No.
Now Herzl, when he spoke at the first Zionist Congress, which is what it was officially called, Anshel, I agree with you. There were first congresses before Herzl, but Herzl had a very powerful line. He looks around the hall and he says, "I see before me rabbis and anti-clericalists." And he said, and this is the proof that Zionism really represents the Jewish people. Now, of course, he meant that in a programmatic way. He meant that he was strengthening the case that Zionism really represents the whole Jewish people. But I think that we can really look at what he was in some ways trying to say, which is that Zionism is the ideology of Jewish cohesiveness. The irony, of course, is that Zionism, for most of its history, was a very divisive ideology. Zionism incorporated the schisms of the Jewish people, political, economic, as you laid out, Anshel, religious, secular, certainly. And so Zionism is certainly not in practice a unifying force, and these days even less so, but as an ideology, as holding up the ideal of what unites the Jewish people in the age of modernity can only be our most basic common denominator. And any attempt to try to raise the threshold and insert what should be an adjective and turn an adjective into the noun is going to alienate large numbers of the Jewish people. And that was the genius. That was the ideological insight of Zionism.
So Yossi, this is very interesting. What you're basically saying, among other things, is that Zionism changed the content of Jewish identity. And
Absolutely.
in that, it was also successful because the anti-Zionists of today, they define their identity. They say, we want a Judaism without Zionism, we want a Judaism without Israel, but they make it all about Israel. They make the anti-Zionists are only defined by being anti-Zionist.
That's the great irony. That is the great irony. And one more point here, Andrés, which is that the Haredim understood this.
Yeah.
I think they may have been the only ones who understood this. And from their perspective, they were absolutely right to oppose Zionism. Because not only was Zionism subversively offering an alternative source of leadership and authority to the rabbis, Zionism was making a much deeper move, which was saying that your Judaism, or what Yitz Greenberg would call the second era Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, is now being replaced by a new third era identity of Jewish people.
Of peoplehood. Thank you. Rachel, over to you and across the ocean. You've been having these conversations in North America and around the world to a certain extent. How these conversations resonate in the United States, in campus? What is the status of the conversation about Zionism there, beyond what we know already, right? What are the longer trends there?
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity, Andrés and Yossi and Anshel. Thank you for your perspectives. I definitely see this conversation form outside of Israel that takes a different set of contours. So first of all, I would add to the conversation around whether it's a program, whether it's an ideology, that we have to actually step back. And Andrés, you did that a little bit in your introduction, talking about understanding that Zionism is about Jews being no longer subjects of history, but now actors in history. And that is revolutionary. It is a revolutionary idea, and it is an idea that is not just about a political formulation of Zionism. What does that mean? When we think about who is the main actor in our Torah, it is the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. It is that land that we talk about on a regular basis because we are a land-based people, which is very hard for many Jews, particularly outside of Israel, and particularly in the context of the American Jewish community, to understand. Because we don't think about what it means to have a connection to this land, and especially a younger generation who says, but it's so far away, it's distant. Now, in addition to being a land-based people who talks about B'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, even if they've never been to B'Yerushalayim, what does it mean then to have this metaphysical connection to a place, and a place that is supposed to infuse one's identity and formulating, as Yossi and Anshel you're talking about, this connection to peoplehood? It's not just about God. It's like when my 11-year-old last year came home from school and he says in a contrarian way, Andrés, you know what? I don't believe in God. And my response to this 11-year-old who's in a day school was, Nadav, can you tell me what you do believe in? And without missing a beat, he says, well, that's easy. The Jewish people. Well, you want to know why he believes in the Jewish people? It's because of the aspirations and the inspiration of Zionism. And it's because that Zionism was not just a political program. It is a component of it for sure. But think about Tel Aviv in the intersection where you have Achad Ha'am, Rachov Achad Ha'am, intersect with Rachov Herzl, right? It is a true cacophony in those early stages of Zionist discourse to try to articulate what does this idea of Zion mean if we no longer are actually in Zion, let alone once we return to this place of Zion in order to actualize a future for the Jewish people in a modern nation state. Right? Like that is very powerful. And it's animating for many individuals who see themselves still as part of that conversation, even if they are not citizens of the state or not in that place. So this has to be, I think, broadened to a certain degree. I will tell you, at least in the American Jewish educational experience, we don't have good Zionist education, Andrés. We barely have good Israel education, if we're being honest. So where Zionist education fits into the conversation of Israel education is actually something that we as Jewish communal educators, leaders, practitioners, let alone philanthropists, need to be thinking about, because the term Zionism, yes, it may have a bad brand. It may have become a slur, but to think that if you just don't talk about it or rebrand it, we are mistaken, because then it's just Israel becomes the bad brand and the dirty word. And the way in which that discourse has played out, and Anshel, you are 100% correct to note, we've been playing on other people's terms. And that's not just the internal Jewish anti-Zionist discourse. It's the way in which in 1975, it gets normalized to think that Zionism is racism. So if you're constantly in a reactive sort of position and a defensive position to say, no, but we're not that, then you can't actually engage in a meaningful understanding of the complexity and the nuance of Zionism, of the cacophony of Zionisms, the discourses that remain, and the impact that Zionism has had on the entire transformation of Jewishness and Jewish peoplehood, irrespective of where Jews are actually living. So that, I think, is part of this conversation in a deep way. I would also just add that we know, and you all know this, and the research is very clear. The majority of American Jews do not know what Zionism is. They are don't knows. So there's a real question of how do you actually influence people to become knows? Because with a very simplistic sentence, we have found through the Boundless research that once you tell them what Zionism is, you will see a 20-point jump in people who are willing to identify with Zionism. But it requires them to actually hit the pause button and recognize that Zionism is not a simplistic understanding of just accepting a particular position by a particular Israeli coalition and the political leaders, right? It is not just about engaging and thinking about Zionism and anti-Zionism and the conversation of what's playing out on the campus quad that we see. But that requires an educational intervention that has to happen way before students ever walk onto a campus quad. It requires that our leaders our rabbis, our educators, our communal professionals don't continue to outsource this conversation to others and rather assume the responsibility to own the conversation. It's like sex and drugs. If you don't talk about it with your children, they're still going to find out about it. So we need to find spaces in order to actually engage in that conversation in a deep, sophisticated, and meaningful way.
Yeah, we're going to get back to that later on, because I think you touched on a very important issue. And anecdotally, like, we all have this experience of meeting with young people that tell you, I'm not a Zionist. And you ask them, wait, you don't think the Jews should have their own state? And of course I believe that. What? That's ridiculous. So you're a Zionist. No, I meant that I don't like Bibi. Well, that's not, so the role of education there, and it's very important, I think, a distinction that we funders don't always make, because of an hardcore ideological anti-Zionist, that they know what they're talking about, and a lot of confused people that just don't understand the terminology around here, and they use the one that they hear on campus, only for our enemies, sorry.
Right. And I would love to hear Yossi and Anshel here as well, Andres, because, I've had a little bit of this conversation with you, Yossi. I really think part of the challenge, at least in the American Jewish community, is that Zionism has been sullied as a term and a concept because one understands that Zionism implies you hold power. And American Jews feel as if, in many cases, that they would like to retain moral purity. And if you hold power, you can't retain moral purity. And so there's this seduction of being powerlessness, right? Having no power. And I don't think any of us would want Jews to not hold power. We've already had that experience historically.
Yeah, it didn't turn out well. Anshel, I want to get back to you, because you're basically saying, well, the solution to all of this is to just stop talking about Zionism. Let's talk about Israel. Let's be very concrete about what Israel should and shouldn't do and how do we participate. But the genie is out of the bottle, right? In a way, like, the conversation about Zionism is everywhere. So how do we deal with that? Right? Like, can we say how do we break that vicious circle, right?
Well, no, I don't agree that the solution is to stop talking about Zionism. The solution obviously is much more elusive, and it's not something that I'm not sure we're going to. I mean, maybe the four of us would agree on some of the solutions or priorities of Israel, but we're not the government of Israel, and the government of Israel has changed and will continue changing, and will not necessarily be representative of what we think and what are the priorities. But I think that the main thing that we need is to kind of get beyond the wrong type of arguments, and Dr. Fish just kind of outlined some of the wrong type of arguments. And by the way, I'm with Nadav. I don't believe in God, but I do believe in Am Yisrael. And if Am Yisrael likes God, has a story of God, then that's my story as well.
For those of you that don't know, Anshel used to be Orthodox, right?
No, I was never Orthodox. Sorry. I'm sorry to burst that myth.
Oh,
I was Orthodox, but not Orthodox.
Orthodox. Sorry. Yeah.
But anyway, the ideas of what we need to do next it's the conversation we need to be having. We need to have both here in Israel, both within the Jewish people, because I think some of the priorities are similar, even though there are conversations that I think Israelis need to be having, and the diaspora perhaps can help, but there is ultimately there's a different level, the different levels of involvement in different things which are happening here. But to be able to have that conversation, we really need to go beyond that. And it's as Dr. Fish said, it's not just the majority of American Jews who don't know what Zionism is. It's Israeli Jews as well. And partly it's because we're having this argument about what Zionism is today, when it really is not a relevant argument, and it's a historic argument to my mind. And it's the question is what Israel does next, and not what Zionism is, because we have Shas, which would have been considered throughout most of the history of Zionism, claiming it's a Zionist party now, and obviously partly because they want to be connected to those corrupt funds that you can get through various Zionist organizations. And we have Aryeh Deri's son is in Juin, and he suddenly has a whole department in the World Zionist Organization, which nobody knows what it even does, but he gets a salary. So the whole, so I'm sorry for going into this narishkeit, but the point is that I think I know what the priorities of Am Yisrael should be, and I write about these things, and people can disagree with me, but if we are stuck in this debate, we will never get around to having that serious conversation. Now, there is a lot of things to be inspired, and this is where I agree with Yossi, that there are things that totally can inspire us from the chiddush that Zionism made of seeing a peoplehood as this kind of organizing base for what we can do as a nation. The fact that we are a nation, and that in itself has inherent value. This is something that has to inspire us today as well. But I think I think the way where we take it has to be to new directions. I think we're facing enormous challenges, and it's not just about ending this terrible, by now sadly criminal war that we are committing. It's also about looking what is happening now to Am Yisrael. We have massive demographic changes, and there are more changes on the way. We've got thousands and soon hundreds of thousands of young Haredi men and women who are already leaving, who are already beginning to their ties to that community, which is an artificial community, which was created after the Shoah. The Haredim are not the authentic Yidden. They are very, very modern. I always say to the Haredi friends, you are more modern and less authentic Jewish than the Reform movement, which was around way before modern Haredism. But it's already losing, and talk to any serious Haredi educator, they'll tell you how many they're losing already. And it's going to become a torrent. So this has to be a priority. We have to think, how are we going to deal with this huge shift within Am Yisrael in the next 10, 20, 30 years? That's where our resources and our thoughts need to be. Not about a few Jews shouting on campus that us Jews hate Israel and want to do that. That's a tiny, irrelevant almost development. We have much bigger things to worry about than, are young Jews, do they want to be Zionists? That's it's such a so low down on, I think, on the list of our priorities.
So if sorry that I cut in because I want to keep this going, but if I translate what you're saying into an educational or a community program, is to say, let's create a movement that is not so much hang on in the terminology, Zionist, not Zionist, but in specific issues and problems that Israel is facing, demographic challenges.
Oh, and the diaspora as well.
Yeah.
These challenges are happening.
And the diaspora,
and I don't think we need to create
by
the way, we don't need to create new movements. We have too many movements. We have too many organizations.
No, I meant
we need to shut down many of our organizations, and the existing ones need to be focused on on stuff that needs to be done.
Yossi, and I have this question for both Yossi and Rachel. There seems to be, we're talking a lot about what Zionism means, but there seems to be sort of a fight for the Zionism brand now. On the external side, becoming a slur, all the things that we discussed. Internally, there's kind of a question about who owns the brand Zionism. And you say you have people on the one hand that would have horrified Herzl, that now are claiming we're the true Zionists. And on the other hand, in other words, how do we define what's the current meaning of Zionism when so many people are claiming that Zionism is what I think it is?
I think there's an ideological question and a practical question. The practical question is really who belongs within a mainstream Jewish conversation. And there, I think the answer, at least for me, is very straightforward. On the one hand, the red line is drawn on the farthest left, the anti-Zionist Jewish organizations, anti-Zionist Jewish leaders, spokespeople do not belong within the Jewish community. And on the far right, Jewish fascists don't belong in the mainstream community. And I was very happy when Ben Gvir was boycotted by Jewish organizations when he came to the United States. So that's a practical question. Ideologically, nobody can define who is a Zionist and who isn't a Zionist. And look, there was always a quasi-Jewish fascist stream in Zionism. I grew up in revisionist Zionism, in the Zionism of Jabotinsky and Begin, which was not fascist, even though Ben-Gurion said it was. But we definitely, I said we, we had a fascist stream. Brit HaBiryonim in the Yishuv in the 1930s was a pro-Mussolini spin-off of the revisionist movement. The Lehi, the Stern Group, had fascist elements in it. It also had far-left elements. But so Zionism, in that sense, is not, it's not possible to police its boundaries. And here I think it's a reflection of what Herzl said. Zionism really represents, in some ways, the totality of the Jewish people. Look, there was a Haredi Zionist group, Poalei Agudat Yisrael, and now, as Anshel notes, of Shas making a grab for the money, suddenly Shas is discovering that it too is a Zionist movement. And ideologically, they all have a place. Now, I believe that Ben Gvir is a betrayal of Zionism, and he, of course, would believe the same about people like me. But that's part of the internal Zionist debate.
Yeah, and Rachel, when I hear this conversation, by the way, there's a question that was sent to me about shouldn't we stop using the term Zionism? And I'm reminded of a conversation I think we both participated many years ago with a famous pollster that says, stop using the term Zionism, it's toxic, use something else. And both you and I said, no, let's own the term. But let's deconstruct that question, because it comes over. It comes
So
up.
do you want to address that question now?
What do you mean?
About whether we should ditch Zionism.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that Rachel, but Rachel was in that, you know what I'm referring to, that event in which we had a pollster telling us it doesn't poll well, so stop using it. So yeah, I would love to hear both of you, but first Rachel, and then going back to Yossi, should we ditch it or not?
Well, I squarely fall in the camp of do not ditch it.
Yeah.
I believe you own it and reclaim it. And in that spirit, it's not to police it. Yossi, I agree with you. You can't police it, but it's to make meaning of it in order that it remains relevant and resonant for future generations of the Jewish community. So, part of that polling sort of attempt was to engage in some kind of strategic communications and to say, well, if there are folks who are turned off by this word, even if they don't know what it means, then you shouldn't use it because it makes them feel uncomfortable, or you're not able to, quote unquote, reach that particular audience. And polling may have a place at certain moments in time, but our detractors, just to be very clear, don't poll and say, guess what? People don't like hearing that Zionism is racism, or Zionism is apartheid, or that, Israel is a settler colonialist state. They push the Overton window for their own agenda and their own ideological purposes. Whereas for many in the Jewish community, we're beating our chests and saying, not in our name, and let's not use this terminology because it makes some people feel offended, while it gets hijacked and manipulated and has assumed a notion or a perception to suggest that Zionism is a form of white Jewish supremacy. Well, this is absurdity. So I'd rather reclaim the term, not just for a theoretical conversation, but in order to be able to actually have foundational understanding about what Zionism has been and what it is and why it remains relevant for Jews, both in Israel and outside of Israel.
So, Yossi, should we teach the term or not?
You know, in the 1990s, I had reached a similar conclusion to yours, Anshel. It was the beginning, and as it turned out, the end also of post-Zionism in Israel as a movement. And it was a spectrum, and the most moderate wing of post-Zionism was very attractive to me. And their argument was really Anshel's, which is Zionism was a program, it succeeded, and we owe Zionism a great deal of gratitude. And we're not post-Zionists because we're repudiating Zionism, but quite the opposite. We're actually acknowledging and celebrating the success of Zionism. And so I was close to that approach. And what began to change for me was the rise of anti-Zionism, which began in the year 2000 with the Durban Conference in South Africa. And that was, in retrospect, that was really the beginning.
I mean, it started before, but it got mainstream in Durban.
It got mainstreamed in Durban.
Yeah.
And what I felt then was that as a matter of Jewish dignity and gratitude, an expression of gratitude to what we owe Zionism, I can't call myself a post-Zionist. I need to own the term Zionism and to uphold it. Now, afterwards, I guess I developed a kind of an ideological rationale, perhaps, or justification by seeing Zionism as much more than a program and really seeing it as the ideology of peoplehood. But at that moment, I still felt that even if Zionism is only that, it's a program that has been fulfilled, we can't allow our enemies to be more passionate about Zionism than we are.
Right.
And I think that that's part of the problem of Zionism, certainly institutionally, is that sometimes it does seem that our enemies care more about Zionism than we do.
Yeah.
And these kinds of conversations, Andrés, that you're convening now are too rare. Our enemies are speaking constantly about Zionism, and we're not.
Yeah. And by the way, in terms of the polling, Rachel, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know more than I about these things, but I think if we just ditch the term Zionism because it polls badly, they're going to come up with another term, like it's going to replace, they're going to say whatever, colonial settler, what have you.
But let me give you the counter argument for a moment. There was a poll that was taken a few years ago among Arab Israelis, asking them, do you support Israel as a Zionist state? And overwhelmingly, 90% rejected. Can you accept Israel as a Jewish state? It was a very clever poll. And there was a slight majority that said, yes, we can live with a Jewish state. And the pollster was trying to unpack this because a Zionist state is a Jewish state. But for many Arab Israelis, a Jewish state just felt a little more neutral. Zionism was a very loaded term. It was Nakba, it was nationalism. Jewish state, well, they're religious, they're a religion, the Jews are a religion, and we have 56 Muslim states. And the Jewish, so suddenly, it really, it made me rethink this question. Now, I think that in terms of our relationship with the Arab-Israeli community, downplaying Zionism is a good idea.
Right.
In terms of our relationship with the rest of the world, I don't think we have a choice. I think we really need to own this. To own this, yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
There's another point here that, for me, it's like very at the risk of being too philosophical here for a second, um, uh, we live in a time in which nationalism is in crisis, right? We're asking, like, America is asking itself what America is, and France is asking itself what France is. And the whole notion of the nation state, as created in the 19th century, is is in flux and is in crisis. So the question I'm wondering is Zionism and Israel is not alien to this crisis. Like, it's normal also that Israel asks itself, what does it mean to be a nation? The Jews ask themselves, what does it mean to be a people in a time of rampant individualism and multiculturalism and the like? So how do these more zeitgeist culture, more sort of philosophical culture questions play out in the case of Zionism? In other words, what is the nationalism? If Zionism was the nationalism of the democratic nationalism of the 19th century, what does it mean to be a nation in the 21st century? And what does Zionism has to say about that?
I mean, look, it's fair to say that the global world order is still created and organized around the formation of sovereignties, right?
Right.
This is still how we exist. You've got how many states and countries right now calling for unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood? So we can't pretend that nationalism doesn't still reign supreme in how we organize the global world order. Now, nationalism obviously has to be in a healthy relationship. You can't have it be jingoistic, chauvinistic, too narrow. This was a conversation that was emerging when you had the decline of empires and the rise of nation states after the First World War. So this is not a new conversation, is my point, Andres. And I wouldn't want this to be seen only in this particular moment in time. It is worth taking a historical understanding. Nation states also aren't the same as states. And we live in a world where you need to define nation state, sovereignty, state, because most of our communities, I don't care in what place, don't even know the differences, where these ideas are similar and overlap and where they diverge. This is also when it's worthwhile putting Israel as a modern nation state in conversation with, in what ways is it similar to other nation states and how does it differ? And when you do that sort of compare and contrast, it helps you identify the unique characteristics of Israel and also what's not so unique about Israel, which is a good thing at times, right?
Yeah.
It's not only about Or Lagoyim. There are many elements here that are about Israel has succeeded because it is like so many other nation states. So this is, I think, part of that conversation, but you are talking about, again, where intellectual ideas intersect in this conversation. Post-nationalism, which emerges in the 1990s, picks up from a post-colonialism discourse from the 1960s. So what I mean by that is post-colonialism says anything created in the era of colonialism, the Western world ought to be dismissed and should be embarrassed by. And now post-nationalism says something similar. You know, it's the fault of the nation state for the problems that we see playing out in the world. So you have to put those intellectual ideas in conversation because a younger generation of people, especially Americans, where America is not a nation state, America is exceptional and is different than a nation state, needs to be understood because young people say this nationalism thing, it's dirty, it's ugly, it's tribalistic. Well, guess what? Much of the world is organized around tribalism, and it doesn't have to be dirty. It doesn't have to be ugly if it's in a healthy relationship with universalism.
Thank you. Now, Anshel, I have a question for you. If you can answer briefly, because I have one more question and then I want to open it up. Are these conversations we're having here, do they hold any relevance for Israelis? Like, meaning, is this a diaspora conversation that we're wrestling with this and we're like, we feel the anti-Zionism, so, or are Israelis also troubled by these questions?
I think it's less of an issue here in Israel because, in a sense, if there is a Zionism, and I spent quarter of an hour explaining why there is no Zionism today. But if there is a Zionism, then it's just living in Israel and, you know, doing Israeli things in Israel and, you know, speaking Hebrew and raising families and being part of Israeli society. That's living the Zionist reality. So it's something we talk about less. You know, it's just different types of conversation, and I understand why it's a conversation that is more prevalent in the diaspora. I also understand why there's this feeling that we need to somehow reclaim Zionism. I think it's a very bad, not good way. I think it's a pity that people like Yossi and Dr. Fisher kind of spend time on reclaiming something because it's playing into the, you know, into the hands of the anti-Zionists. Well, their efforts and, you know, their efforts and their, you know, their intellect and everything they can do, you know, their resources would be so much better directed at real problems rather than, okay, who gives a something over what some idiot has to say about Zionism. I mean, seriously, why? It's not like we're not going to educate them. So, you know, it's a nice idea to reclaim, but I don't think, you know, I don't think we're going to get there. And like I said, it's not the conversation in Israel, and
Yeah.
it won't be because we have actually much more immediate problems to deal with.
Yeah, unless I would challenge Yossi.
Yeah, I think that where Zionism is especially relevant ideologically in Israel today is that I see Zionism as the ideology of a Jewish and democratic state, and each of those elements is under assault. The democratic state is under assault internally.
Okay,
And
so,
even the
so let me
and-
say, if I
and-
can interject.
Well, let him finish. Let him finish.
So
Let him
I just
finish.
wanted to say something before that. I kind of cut myself off, but if we need to reclaim something, we need to reclaim Judaism. Judaism is something that I'm not going to, you know, I don't think that we're going to say we can be post-Judaists. And Judaism is under assault by Kahanis, Jewish supremacists, by ultra-Orthodox obscurantists, and by Haredi Leumi ultra-nationalist worship of blood and land, and they're the ones who, you know, that we need to reclaim
But
our
Anshel,
Yiddishkeit
you're
Yes.
basically saying the same. You're basically
No,
just
I'm
saying
saying,
Judaism.
I say forget Zionism. It's much more basic. We need to
Yes,
reclaim
there's
Judaism.
a crisis of Israeli Judaism, but
No, also in the diaspora.
Well, you can see now that they are Israelis. They interrupt each other all the time.
So let me briefly make an argument for three challenges that Zionism needs to address. The first is strengthening the Jewish people worldwide, which includes a new mandate for Zionism, which is diaspora, strengthening diaspora. I think that if you are the ideology of Jewish peoplehood, your responsibility is to create and to strengthen an Israel-centered world Jewish people. The second is strengthening, perhaps we really even need to begin inventing an Israeli people. What is an Israeli people that is not the Jewish people? What is an Israeli people that can create a shared identity between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, as difficult as that seems now? So first of all, in terms of peoplehood, I would expand what I've said earlier to include a Jewish people and an Israeli people. These are the two challenges in terms of identity. The third challenge, and here I connect very much with what Anshel was saying, is the third challenge of Zionism, and this is a challenge. Anshel will challenge me about why this is a Zionist challenge, and I think that's an important conversation. But I think that the third challenge is creating an Israeli Judaism, which doesn't yet exist. We don't yet really have an Israeli Judaism that hasn't been based on imports from the ghetto, and that includes religious Zionism as well. to a large extent.
Uh,
So the question really is, what is the future of an Israeli forms of Judaism? These are three challenges that I think relate
Right.
directly to Zionism.
Rachel, what is the future of Zionism for you? Is it high tech? Is it Israelis discovering the cure for cancer? Or is it something else? Is it like a new concept of what being Jewish in an age of national sovereignty means?
I think I'm somewhere in between Anshel and Yossi here. For me, Zionism really is and the embodiment of a Jewish people from across diasporas and in Israel who understand the value and centrality of peoplehood as a force for the future of Jewishness. Irrespective of how Judaism may be practiced, it allows for an expression and a manifestation in the modern nation state of Israel. But I think I'm in complete agreement with you, Yossi. It is an expression that is deeply rooted in that tight, taut relationship of Jewish and democratic. And in that conversation, Zionism has to grapple with what does it mean to be the majority and what are its responsibilities to the minority. And it's not theoretical in any shape or form. That's very real, which is very different for Jews who are living outside of Israel, who are only in minority positions and thinking about what does it mean to be a vulnerable minority in relationship to the majority. So this is how I think about Zionisms. And I do think, and what I have found is that when you expose the complexity of this conversation, not just for theoretical purposes, but really for the purposes that we're talking about in order for it to animate our thinking and how we engage, and what does it mean for Israelis and for Jews outside of Israel to actually have that mifgash and to understand where the fault lines are and the tensions. Where do we see the failures of Jewish diaspora, and in particular American Jews who don't know Hebrew, who don't have the ability to embrace Hebrew culture and identity, who don't understand the political realities on the ground in Israel? That's where we need to be thinking about what are the interventions that we need to be thinking about from a Zionist framework in order to create those bridges.
So I gotta use my prerogative here to just float, a thought. You talked before, Rachel, about powerlessness and just, being enamored of their powerlessness because it gives them moral virtue. But I'm thinking that the real challenge of the Jewish people, and probably the most important challenge that the Jewish people has in a way, is how to exercise power and sovereignty. In other words, it's very cowardly to say, oh, I'd rather not have power than confront the complexity of power. So, as Yossi was saying, Judaism, as we know it, is a creation of the diaspora. It has, of course, the component of the land, but rabbinic Judaism, as we know it, is. And now we have all these Jewish values, all this culture, all this tradition that was very easy to implement because we didn't have power. We didn't have real dilemmas. Like, it was very easy to talk about social justice when you don't have to run an economy. It's very interesting to talk about humanist laws of law when you don't have to fight a mass murdering bunch of terrorists, right? So I think that those dilemmas that the Jewish people are confronting now are probably the most interesting and they're hard, but they're interesting and fascinating. And that's where the richness of Judaism and Zionism lies today, in really trying to continue building a state that is this intersection of historical Judaism and the reality of the world. So I think that I want to thank you all for this fascinating conversation. We need to close. Just if each of you want to say one final word, but literally 10 seconds. Anshel, anything to add?
No, I think you've summarized it very well. We can already say Shana Tova is probably the best thing. Hopefully a better year than the awful one which is about to end.
Yossi?
Shana Tova, everyone, and it's wonderful to be with all of you.
Rachel?
Shana Tova. Thank you, Andres, and thank you, Yossi and Anshel, for the intellectual stimulation.
And as we said, תחל שנה וקללותיה, תחל שנה וברכותיה. This year ends with all its curses and a new one start with all its blessing, especially and foremost the return of all the captives to their loved ones.
Amen.
Rabbi Serviu, send us off, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this incredibly deep, intelligent, and informative conversation. I only wish that more people in this world were able to look at this subject with the nuance that we have shared here today. And I want to thank our entire audience for joining us, and just bring your attention very quickly to the fact that JFN has an in-person gathering in San Francisco on October 20th, the JFN West convening. If you are on the West, anywhere of the west side of the US, you are welcome to join us. We have a webinar next week from the Gender Lens Philanthropy Peer Network, which is a program called Rights on Trial, which is legal advocacy to protect women, which will be featuring Lisa Eisen from the Schusterman Foundation, along with experts from the National Council of Jewish Women and the National Women's Law Center. And right after the Chagim, we are launching a new series called Jewish Wisdom for Philanthropists, where we are going to delve into how Jewish wisdom really has very deep ideas to share to those of us who work in the field of philanthropy. And that is going to be led by yours truly and Dan Levinson from the Lippman Camphor Foundation. And we very much hope that you will join us for all sorts of future learning, both in person and online. And with that, Shana Tova, may it be a sweet, happy, safe, and most of all, peaceful new year for all of us. Thank you.